Hello YouTube. The games in the Elder Scrolls universe all take place on Tamriel, but despite this fact there's much more out there in the bigger world of Nirn than just the continent of Tamriel. There are other large continents like Akavir, Atmora and Yokuda that I've all covered before on the channel, but there's also some smaller, obscurer islands in Nirn's oceans. And today I want to give a little bit of an overview of these smaller obscure islands and give you a bit of a sense of what they're like and perhaps if we know what's going on there. After the intro. So, Nirn, the larger planet that the Elder Scrolls universe takes place in. It has several larger documented continents, but we also know of some smaller, more obscure islands that we can find around the continent, with some of them reportedly being a bit weird. Now, a big disclaimer here is that we have no idea what the geographical layout of most of these islands is, and for some we don't even know its precise location, as we only heard about them in the lore, meaning that most of the maps that I'm showing will be fan-made maps. For example, this globe, which I often use on the channel, was made by my friend Ares, but it's not an official Bethesda map. The only official map that I'll be using in this video is this one that came with the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, which shows some of the obscure islands that we'll talk about. All the other maps will be fan-made maps, as that's unfortunately all we have. Okay, let's get into the islands. Now, the first set of islands that I'd like to talk about is this group of 3 islands far to the east of Tamriel, which are probably also the most well known of the obscure islands. They're located somewhere between Tamriel and the continent of Akavir. Again, we don't know their exact location, this is just a fan map. These islands are Kathnoque, Azronit and Inslia. These 3 islands have one big thing in common, and that is that they were used as a bit of a staging ground and in-between point for the Imperial invasion of Akavir by Emperor Uriel Septim V, who tried, and failed, to conquer Akavir. He conquered these islands first, to use them as waypoints for his supply lines, putting his main supply point on the islands of Azronit, where he used and expanded the main port of the island, Black Harbor, as a staging ground for his fleet. And even after the fall of the Emperor's forces in Akavir and the Emperor's ultimate demise, these islands remained Imperial territory all the way up until the Oblivion Crisis. Now, it's possible that the Empire under the Medes in the 4th era still has control over these islands, but I doubt it, as before they took power, the Empire completely fell apart, and Titus Mede reportedly had to reconquer most of Tamriel through force and diplomacy, but there's no mention that he ever went to these islands or tried to reincorporate them into the Empire. So I presume that they're no longer under Imperial control and once more independent. But hey, it's possible. Now, something else that we know for certain is that Azronit, being by far the most developed island in the lore, by Tamriel's inhabitants is known as the Spice Island, which produces much of Tamriel's exotic spices like hot pepper, cloves, mace and nutmeg. We also know that the island is ruled by princes, as Emperor Uriel Septim V in his conquest of the island defeated the island's ruler, Prince Bashomon, who ended up surrendering to Imperial rule. Now, of Inslia and Kathnoque we know almost nothing from official sources. However, in texts by ex-Elder Scrolls writers and developers written after they left Bethesda, so not explicitly canon, it's made clear that these islands are all inhabited by some sort of cousin of the Chimer, the ancestors to the Dunmer or Dark Elves in modern day, who were inspired by native Hawaiians and are mostly fisherfolk. In those texts, the inhabitants of Kathnoque are called the Chimerike, and they live primarily of fishing and trade. But those are unofficial texts and can be retconned by Bethesda tomorrow if they feel like it, so take all of that with a grain of salt, okay? But now let's talk about the next island, Roscrea. Now, Roscrea is an island that we once again know very little about, which could kinda be the mantra of this video. We know that it's somewhere north of Solitude, but we don't know whether that means north-north or northeast or northwest. The island first appears in the lore during the 3rd era. During the 3rd era conquerings of Emperor Uriel Septim V before he went to Akavir. And until Emperor Uriel Septim V conquered it, it seems that the island had some sort of politically independent population. Now, several hundred years later, we know that the Imperial influence on the island seems to have waned slightly, after which the Jarl of Solitude decided to have a crack at filling that waning influence by making Roscrea an official territory of Hafingar Hold. After conquering the island and replacing the Imperial legionnaires who seemed to have already left the island by that point. Ever since then, the island seems to have once again become independent in the more than 200 years since Solitude's conquest, as by the time of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim there's no more mention of the island anywhere, except for in the history books. So I presume it's no longer part of Solitude Hold, but hey, maybe it is and the devs just forgot about it when making Skyrim. Now, next up we will talk about a set of islands between Tamriel and what remains of the sunken continent of Yokuda: Kavala, Hurn, Sespar, Pancor, and the group of islands colloquially named the Chain. These islands we just know very little about once again, but there are some things that we do know. First of all, we know that most, if not all of them, are tropical islands and islands with a bit more Mediterranean climate, so warm but not particularly tropical. Maybe with the exception of Kavala due to its longitude, as it seems to be in a similar climate zone as High Rock. All of the islands seem to be inhabited by humans, and all of them have regular interaction with Tamriel in the form of trading and travel. In fact, there's some suggestion that during the Third Era, Hurn, Sespar and the Island Chain were actually part of the Empire, as they were back then almost all regarded as a territory of Hammerfell's different kingdoms, which were back then part of the Empire. But save for a few throwaway lines of dialogue and lore, there wasn't much that was mentioned on these islands. We know, for example, that especially Sespar had a bit of an interaction with Tamriel, as people from there tended to travel to Tamriel, and we know that at least in the Second Era, the island was used as a place to exile a noblewoman who could banish from Tamriel. She was then sent to Sespar in an almost Napoleon-esque situation, because he was also exiled to a remote island, twice even. Now, of Hurn we actually know a bit more ancient history, as during the conquest of Hammerfell by the ancestors of the Redguards, the Yokudans, this is where the Yokudan nobility had a temporary base before setting shop on Tamriel, as they seem to have used this island as a launchpad of sorts for their invasion of the continent. You see, when the great continent of Yokuda faced its mysterious doom and started to sink into the sea, many of its inhabitants, the Yokudans, fled to find safe haven on the shores of Tamriel in what we call the Ragada, or the Warrior Waves. These Warrior Waves conquered Hammerfell as a new place to live, but before they landed on Hammerfell, they first conquered Hurn, which was apparently already occupied by a Tamrielic tribe of humans, who the Yokudans just completely annihilated when they landed on the island. Their nobility then largely stayed behind on the island, while their armies launched their invasion of Hammerfell from this island. And ever since then, it seems that the island has largely stayed inhabited by Redguards, the descendants of the ancient Yokudans. And I personally wouldn't be surprised if perhaps their culture would be a bit more traditionalist than the rest of Hammerfell, as it was here where Redguard culture on Tamriel kind of officially started. Now, of the Chain we know literally nothing, just like we know nothing of Kavala and Pancor. It can be assumed that during the exodus from Yokuda people also landed there, perhaps the islands are also dominated by Redguards. Who knows really, I sure don't, as there is no further lore on them. Other than that maps suggest that the Chain may be part of Hammerfell, while Kavala and Pancor seem to be independent islands. And that's literally all that we know. Now, a group of islands that we know quite a bit more about is the Sisters, a group of volcanic islands similarly west of Tamriel, consisting of 4 islands: High Isle, Amenos, Galen and Ifilon. These islands, which were introduced in the Elder Scrolls Redguard, then expanded upon in the Elder Scrolls Online, and then mentioned again in Oblivion Remastered, have a pretty interesting history, as by the Second and Third Eras, these islands are officially a Breton duchy, as the Bretons of High Rock have colonized the islands. In fact, we know so much about these islands that a dedicated video on them at some point is very much warranted. But what you need to know for now is that it's a small archipelago consisting of 4 volcanic islands. You've got High Isle, the biggest island of the archipelago, which has a bit of a Mediterranean southern European climate, similar to County Anvil in Cyrodiil. It has by far the biggest population and has become kind of a miniature High Rock. In fact, that's also why it's named High Isle, because someone renamed it in the image of High Rock. Now, then you've got Amenos, a tropical jungle island where, save for a small walled settlement on the coasts, you'll find mostly wilderness. That island is known for being essentially one big prison, as prisoners throughout history have been kicked into the island's jungles to either survive or die in the wilds. And the final 2 islands, Galen and Ifilon, have the smallest population comparatively, with Galen being mostly unexplored wilderness, save for 1 Breton settlement, and Ifilon being a mostly unoccupied volcano island. Now, that does not mean that there isn't a significant population out there in the wilderness, as outside the cities in the island's wildernesses, there's a large presence of Breton druids who have their own camps and villages, mostly across High Isle, Galen and Ifilon's wildernesses. What's interesting is that it were actually the Druids who first came to these islands, fleeing war in High Rock as they sought a new home. So these Breton Druids were actually the first ones to settle on these islands in the early First Era. Then, a few hundred years later, another race settled on the islands, but far from the west, as the Left-Handed Elves, or the Sinistral Elves, a race of elf from Yokuda, had a clan settle themselves on the islands, as they tried to flee from Yokuda, where their race was being exterminated by the Yokudans long before the fall of that continent. The Left-Handed Elves then tried to take over the islands, conquering them and driving the Druids hiding into the wilds. But then Yokuda began its strange sinking doom, and the Yokudans who fled the continent found the Left-Handed Elves there, a remnant of their ancient enemies, and they just exterminated them, and then they moved on, leaving the islands once more empty and leaving them to the Druids, as the Yokudans in the forms of the warrior waves moved on towards Tamriel, and the Druids once again moved out of hiding into the islands. And then the islands were eventually settled by Bretons and Imperials at large to serve as shipyards, as there was plenty of wood on the islands, and at the time, near the end of the First Era, there was a big demand for ships, as the All-Flags Navy, a navy consisting of ships from all around Tamriel, was being assembled. That navy was assembled as a reaction to the Thracian Plague, one of the worst epidemics on Tamriel, which was unleashed on Tamriel by the Slode, a race of slug creatures, necromancers, who live on the continent of Thras between the Sisters and Yokuda. That navy banded together almost all of the peoples of Tamriel, and ended up completely destroying Thras in revenge for the Thracian Plague. But some Bretons and Imperials decided to stick around on the islands, and the island chain then became a mini province of the Alessian Empire. And the Alessian Empire then ended up selling the islands again in a bad financial time to a noble house of High Rock, only for it to then become part of the Second Empire again under the Akaviri potentates, who seem to have peacefully added the islands to their territory, and then began the tradition of sending political prisoners to the island of Amenos, the jungle prison island, officially making it the island prison that it's now. And then finally, after the fall of the Second Empire, these islands became more or less independent, switching hands quite a few times among several Breton noble houses, but remaining in the hands of the Breton nobility. And it's been that way basically ever since, it seems. The islands by the Third Era are still a part of High Rock's cultural sphere, as is mentioned in Oblivion Remastered, and kind of serve as the home away from home for many Breton nobles, who kind of treat the islands as their vacationing grounds, while the economy of the islands themselves is basically now based on producing spices and building ships, as the ancient shipyards still function, which is pretty cool. Now, that was a criminally short history of the Sisters, but to prevent this video from becoming like 80% Sisters history, I'll probably end up making a lore video on them specifically at some point in the future. So, let's move on to the next island, the island of Vonura. An island that's supposedly roughly here, about a month's voyage away from Vardenfell. The island, called Vonura, we know, again, almost nothing about. Well, we actually know one thing about it, and that's that this island seems to be inhabited by Dark Elves, and that it's outside the jurisdiction of Morrowind's great houses. The island itself seems to be a remote and isolated place where Morak Tong assassins, who have become too famous to do their job, generally travel to in order to escape their fame and live in quiet retirement. The island seems to only have a very small and isolated population, probably like only fishermen and agriculture, but that's mostly speculation, as the only thing we really know is that it's calm enough for a retired killer to live there. Now, finally we have an island that has been a very recent addition to the lore, the island of Solstice on Tamriel's southern coast, south of Blackmarsh. We don't know that much about the island yet, as the DLC it's based on is yet to release. However, we do know that the island is a very interesting mix of Argonian and High Elf culture, as Argonians settled here from southern Blackmarsh during the Meretic era, while similarly a clan of High Elves who left the Somerset Isles colonized the island during an exodus from the Somerset Isles, and now these two races just live there together. During the upcoming DLC, we know that necromancers of the worm cults are preparing something sinister on the islands, and presumably it's up to us as the player to stop them. And I'll doubtlessly make a more in-depth video on Solstice at some point, but for now this is about all I can say. And that brings us to the end of this video, on the smaller islands around Nirn of course. If you want to know more about the larger continents in the oceans like Atmora, Akavir, Yokuda, Altmuris, Thras and Piandene, I'm putting links in the description to my dedicated lore videos on those places. And soon I'll probably also launch a big long-form lore collection on all of the places outside of Tamriel, where I'll talk about those places and more. I will also put that in the description once it's out. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video and that I managed to teach you something new about the Elder Scrolls universe, and if I did, why not give the video a like, as that's how the YouTube algorithm decides what kind of content is worthy and what kind of content is not. Now, observant viewers maybe already noticed that I've already talked about these islands a few years back, but since then there have been quite a few new discoveries and additions to the lore, so it felt worth to try and remaster the video with the most updated and relevant information. And now, all that remains for me to be done is to vocally thank my top Patreon supporters, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, His Soul, King Chris 20, RB Dash, Steve G, Volkure of Argonia, Rakai, Sword of Bushido, and Mr. Christmas. These wonderful people, along with all the other people on screen, so my Patreon subscribers and my YouTube members, make my weekly videos possible, and for that I am very grateful. That being said, I will see you all in the next lore video. Bye bye.